over the last century, and I think it has been a bargain. Congress has given these agencies a lot of work to do that is not traditionally executive work, that is more along the lines of make rules when we issue broad delegations and do lots of adjudications that set the rules for industries and entire bodies of governance, right? And they've given all of that power to these agencies largely with it in mind that the agencies are not under the control of a single person, of the president, but that indeed Congress has a great deal of influence over them too. And if you take away a half of this bargain, you end up with just massive, uncontrolled, unchecked power in the hands of the.
You just heard the voice of Justice Elena Kagan warning us with clinical precision about what we're witnessing in real time, and if you felt your stomach drop listening to her words, then good, because that means you still have a functioning democratic nervous system. She's describing the blueprint for autocracy, dressed up in constitutional robes, and the fact that she has to explain this while sitting on the same bench as the 6 justices actively engineering this nightmare should make your blood run cold because of this week. Trump has attempted to remove multiple officials at the Federal Trade Commission, National Labor Relations Board, and Federal Reserve, systematically dismantling the very architecture of accountability that prevents presidents from becoming monarchs. The Supreme Court issued a 6-3 ruling along ideological lines approving Trump's emergency request to remove Rebecca Slaughter, a Democratic commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission, and this is happening right now while you're listening to this, not as some theoretical exercise in law school seminars, but as the actual demolition of nearly a century of carefully constructed guardrails against executive tyranny. Let's understand what Kagan is telling us in that clip, because every word matters and every word should terrify you. She's talking about the administrative bargain, this essential compromise that's defined American governance since the New Deal, where Congress delegates authority to expert agencies, precisely because those agencies were designed to operate with independence from raw political power, staffed by professionals who understand environmental science and financial regulation and workplace safety, people who don't change with every electoral wind, but who build institutional memory and expertise over decades. Kagan recently warned it could mean the end of administrative governance as we know it, stating that Humphreys undergirds a significant feature of American governance, bipartisan administrative bodies carrying out expertise-based functions with a measure of independence from presidential control. And what she's describing there is the entire modern state, the apparatus that investigates food contamination and monitors air quality and enforces labor laws and prosecutes white-collar crime. When she warns about giving the president massive uncontrolled, unchecked power, she's not being hyperbolic. She's reading directly from the playbook that Trump's lawyers are literally arguing in court, and that Project 2025 proposed using to justify giving Trump or another president maximum control over the executive branch, with the Trump 2024 campaign platform including an expansion of executive power grounded in this theory. And here's where we need to connect the dots, because none of this is happening in isolation. It's all part of a meticulously planned assault on democratic governance that culminated in July, when the court ruled that former President Trump is at least presumptively immune from criminal liability for his official acts, with the court's 6-3 majority freeing presidents to use their official powers to engage in criminal acts substantially free of accountability. Let that sink in for a moment, because Justice Sonia Sotomayor said in her dissent that the majority gives President Trump all he asks for and more, and that under the majority's rule, a president's use of any official power for any purpose, even the most corrupt, is immune from prosecution. We're talking about a Supreme Court decision that essentially places the president above the law for anything he does while wielding executive power, and now Trump and his allies are systematically working to ensure that executive power extends to every corner of the federal government, every regulatory body, every independent commission, every watchdog agency that was specifically created to exist outside presidential control. Legal analysts see a common goal behind Trump's actions: to test the unitary executive theory, which asserts that the president has unlimited power to control the actions of the 4 million people who make up the executive branch, and if courts uphold arguments based on this theory, it would give Trump and subsequent president unprecedented power to remove and replace any federal employee and impose their will on every decision in every agency. This isn't conservative governance, this is authoritarian consolidation, and the chilling reality is that experts have argued the unitary executive theory has been guiding the Roberts Court over the past 2 decades. Which means this isn't some sudden coup. It's a decades-long project coming to fruition right before our eyes. The theory entered public discourse with the George W. Bush administration and found a strong advocate in President Donald Trump. But what Trump is doing goes beyond anything Bush contemplated, because in 2019, Trump said, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president," which is not a legal argument. It's the statement of a would-be dictator. Now let me tell you what's happening on the ground right this second, because Trump has attempted to remove multiple officials, including at the Federal Trade Commission, National Labor Relations Board, and Federal Reserve, polls, and every single one of these removals is calculated to set up the test case that will go to the Supreme Court, where the six-justice conservative supermajority will almost certainly obliterate the last remaining constraints on presidential power. Kagan accused her conservative colleagues of allowing Trump to discharge a member of the FTC without any cause, just as they had let him do with the other independent agencies made up of bipartisan members, the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. These aren't just bureaucratic reshufflings, these are demolitions of the separation of powers, because these agencies were created by Congress precisely to operate independently, to make decisions based on expertise and evidence rather than political expediency. And Trump is systematically beheading them one by one while the Supreme Court cheers him on. Kagan cited the 1935 case Humphrey's Executor v. United States, noting that Congress may restrict the president's power to remove members of the FTC, as well as other agencies performing quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial functions without violating the Constitution. And what she's pointing to is nearly a century of settled law that's about to be thrown in the garbage. The March 2025 D.C. Circuit Court ruling that the president could legally remove members of the National Labor Relations Board and Merit Systems Protection Board was seen as a likely precursor to the Supreme Court reviewing its Humphrey's Executor precedent, which means we're watching the scaffolding being erected for constitutional demolition. When Kagan wrote that the emergency docket should never be used to permit what precedent bars and should not be used to transfer government authority from Congress to the president and thus reshape the nation's separation of powers, she was screaming into the void because her colleagues have already decided how this story ends. Let's talk about what this means in practice. Because theory becomes tyranny when it's implemented, Project 2025 describes the administrative state as the policy-making work done by the bureaucracies of all the federal government's departments, agencies, and millions of employees, which is viewed in the document as an obstacle to overcome. Think about what that means. The entire apparatus of modern governance, everything from the EPA to the FDA to OSHA to the NLRB, is conceptualized as the enemy, as something to be conquered and subjugated. Trump has made Project 2025's call to dismantle the administrative state a central tenet of his second term, with the project director saying Trump's efforts have exceeded his expectations and calling dismantling the administrative state his #1 goal, and the essence, the ethos behind it. And here's the mechanism they're using to achieve this authoritarian transformation. Because OPM estimates 50,000 positions, or about 2% of federal workers, will be reclassified under the new Schedule F rule, with OPM proposing a rule reclassifying tens of thousands of career civil servants as at-will employees. Schedule F stems from a Trump executive order, in which tens of thousands of civil servants who serve in roles deemed to have some influence over policy would be reassigned, losing their employment and union protections upon reassignment, making them functionally at-will employees and therefore far easier to fire, with Schedule F defying merit principles and instead requiring political loyalty to a president. This is how you purge a government of anyone who might resist illegal orders, anyone who might say no, anyone who retains loyalty to the Constitution rather than to the dear leader. Project 2025 advocates for a revival of Schedule F as part of a larger crackdown on the civil service, with architects plainly saying their aim is to bend or break the bureaucracy to the presidential will, and that phrase "bend or break" should tell you everything you need to know about their intentions. The historical parallels here should be making alarm bells ring at deafening volumes, because this is how democratic backsliding happens, not with tanks in the streets but with the systematic capture of institutions, the purging of independent actors, the consolidation of power in a single executive who answers to no one. Critics point to countries where similar changes to a more unitary executive have resulted in democratic backsliding, and we don't need to look to Hungary or Turkey or Venezuela for case studies when we can see it unfolding in real time in Washington. Trump v. United States has significantly weakened bulwarks within government that would traditionally investigate claims of public corruption, permitting the presidency more authority than America has seen in generations, with Justice Elena Kagan stating in a recent dissent that the Supreme Court has handed the president the most unitary administration since Herbert Hoover and maybe ever. Think about what Kagan was actually saying in that oral argument clip, because she's not talking about abstract constitutional theory. She's describing the concrete mechanisms of how Congress and the executive branch have shared power for a century. Roberts and Kagan have been clashing for more than a decade over an increasingly relevant question of presidential power. How easy should it be for the president to fire the heads of independent agencies? And this long-running battle reached its crescendo when Roberts led the court to a 5-4 decision striking down the leadership structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as a violation of the constitutional separation of powers. Each case is another brick removed from the wall that separates presidential power from presidential tyranny, and Chief Justice Roberts has been wielding the sledgehammer with methodical precision, elevating an expansive theory of executive power while systematically diminishing congressional authority to structure independent agencies. And we need to be absolutely clear about what Trump himself has said, because Trump in 2019 said, "I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president," which is not how constitutional democracy works. That's how autocracy works. In 2017, Trump complained that because he's president, he's not supposed to be involved with the Justice Department or FBI, and the unitary executive theory suggests that such limits wrongly curtail the powers of the chief executive. He's been remarkably transparent about his authoritarian impulses, and rather than serving as a disqualifying revelation, it's become the blueprint that his legal team and the conservative legal movement have worked tirelessly to legitimize and constitutionalize. The ideological architecture behind this transformation has deep roots in the conservative legal movement because formed by conservative legal theorists in the 1980s to help President Ronald Reagan roll back liberal policies. The unitary executive theory promises to radically expand presidential power, and what began as a fringe theory on the edges of conservative legal thought has become the governing philosophy of a Supreme Court majority. Multiple current Supreme Court justices were involved in Reagan's efforts to gain power over civil rights agencies, which helped build the unitary executive theory. So we're watching the fulfillment of a 40-year project, the culmination of careful judicial appointments and strategic litigation, and patient institution building by the Federalist Society and Heritage Foundation, and all the dark money networks that have been playing the long game while liberals assumed the arc of history bent toward justice on its own. Here's what makes this moment so uniquely dangerous, because the power of the presidency was expanded by the Supreme Court through its ruling in Trump v. the United States, the immunity case, which means Trump doesn't just have expanded control over the executive branch, he has immunity from prosecution for exercising that control. The result of Supreme Court decisions appears to be that President Trump is effectively immune from prosecution for criminal acts now or in the future. You see how this works? First you give the president immunity, then you give him unchecked control over every regulatory agency and independent commission, then you remove all the career civil servants who might resist illegal orders and replace them with loyalists, and suddenly you don't have a republic anymore. You have what Justice Sotomayor described when she wrote that in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. The mechanics of this authoritarian project are being implemented with ruthless efficiency right now because, upon taking office, Trump undertook mass firings of federal employees, inspectors general, and members of independent agencies and oversight boards who could attempt to block or constrain his moves. Every inspector general fired, every independent commissioner removed, every whistleblower silenced is another safeguard dismantled, another check eliminated, another balance destroyed. Trump and his administration have furthered unitary executive theory by repeatedly invoking Article 2 of the Constitution to justify recent dismissals, framing the article as allowing the president to use the whole of the executive branch for his political ends, with the White House invoking the article to rationalize an executive order, asserting the president's authority over almost all regulatory agencies created by Congress to act independently. The expansive administrative state that Project 2025 seeks to build is one that fits a distinctly authoritarian model, meaning first and foremost a consolidation of political power in the president by eliminating the political insulation that independent agencies have long enjoyed. And we need to understand that they're not actually dismantling the administrative state, they're capturing it, weaponizing it, turning every lever of federal power into an instrument of presidential will. The plan requires a significant erosion of constitutional checks and balances and federalism principles, which is constitutional scholar language for "this is how democracies die." When Justice Kagan warns in that clip about the bargain between Congress and the executive being broken, about agencies being given lots of work with the understanding they wouldn't be under the control of a single person, She's describing the entire post-New Deal constitutional order. The administrative state emerged not as some socialist conspiracy, but as a pragmatic response to the complexity of modern industrial society, because Congress cannot possibly write detailed regulations about every chemical compound and financial instrument and workplace hazards, so it delegates authority to agencies staffed with experts who can. But the crucial element is that those agencies were structured to be somewhat insulated from political pressure, so that environmental regulations would be based on science rather than which party won the last election, but the financial regulations would reflect economic evidence rather than the preferences of presidential donors. What Trump and the Roberts Court are systematically destroying is this insulation, this independence, and Kagan expressed concerns that giving the president control over independent agencies could give him massive, unchecked, uncontrolled power, with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson noting that Congress has established federal agencies to contain nonpartisan experts working on certain issues for the good of the American people. Jackson said, "I understand that the president would rather control them, but that's not really his decision in the overall scheme of things." And she's exactly right, except the Supreme Court majority is about to rule that it is his decision, that the president gets to control everything, that the separation of powers was just a suggestion we can discard whenever it proves inconvenient to executive ambition. The real-world consequences of this constitutional revolution are already devastating because when you strip civil service protections and fire career professionals and replace them with political loyalists, you don't get more efficient government, you get corrupt, incompetent government. Research has found that converting career employees to Schedule F and removing their civil service protections is likely to degrade government performance, which should be obvious to anyone who thinks about it for more than 5 seconds because expertise matters, institutional memory matters, having people who know what they're doing actually matters. But degrading government performance might actually be the goal, because if you can make government dysfunctional enough, you can use that dysfunction to justify further dismantling, further consolidation of power in the hands of a wealthy elite who don't need functioning government services because they can buy their own. This is why some have estimated that there would be a loss of up to 1 million federal jobs if Project 2025 is implemented because the goal isn't reform, it's demolition. A second Trump administration would consolidate executive power, fire over 50,000 civil servants and replace them with MAGA loyalists, and eliminate or dismantle agencies like the Department of Education and NOAA. And every one of those fired civil servants represents decades of expertise lost, institutional knowledge destroyed, democratic accountability eliminated. When you fire the scientists at NOAA, and the teachers at the Department of Education, and the labor investigators at the NLRB, you're not draining any swamp. You're destroying the mechanisms through which democratic governance actually functions. And here's what should terrify you most of all, because the Supreme Court isn't going to save us. The Supreme Court is actively engineering this catastrophe. It appears to many observers and scholars that Trump's actions have intentionally invited court cases by which he hopes the judiciary will embrace unitary executive theory and thus permit him to do even more, and the current Supreme Court appears ready to grant that wish. Every constitutional guardrail we thought was secure, every check and balance we assumed was permanent, is being systematically dismantled by 6 justices who have decided that executive power should be essentially unlimited as long as it's exercised by a Republican president. The Trump immunity case did not rely on unitary executive theory, but Chief Justice John Roberts could not help but reference it, writing that the president is the only person who alone composes a branch of government, and Justice Sonia Sotomayor saw the chilling implications of that line of thinking, warning that in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. Roberts has been building toward this moment for years, case by case, precedent by precedent, each decision expanding presidential power and contracting congressional authority, until we've arrived at this precipice where the entire architecture of democratic accountability is about to collapse. When you listen to Justice Kagan in that clip, you hear the controlled desperation of someone who understands exactly what's happening and knows she's powerless to stop it. She's watching her institution become an instrument of autocracy, watching her colleagues systematically dismantle nearly a century of constitutional development, and all she can do is dissent, to create a record for future generations who might wonder how we let this happen. The Supreme Court issued a 6-3 ruling along ideological lines. Because of course it did. Because this was never about law or precedent or constitutional interpretation. It was always about power, about which party gets to exercise it, and which constitutional constraints can be discarded in pursuit of it. The founders created separation of powers precisely to prevent the concentration of authority in a single person, because they understood that unchecked executive power inevitably leads to tyranny. They lived under a king and fought a revolution to escape monarchical rule, and they designed a constitutional system with elaborate checks and balances specifically to prevent the emergence of another monarch. What we're witnessing is the systematic demolition of that design, the careful reconstruction of exactly the kind of unaccountable executive power that the Constitution was written to prevent. The court must recognize its role as the protector, not destroyer, of the U.S. Constitution, and must refrain from presidential appeasement and empowerment beyond anything considered acceptable by the founders who adopted the Constitution as a constraint on the executive. But the court has already chosen appeasement, has already chosen empowerment, has already chosen to make the president a king. This is the fight of our generation, because once these precedents are set, once this power is consolidated, once these institutions are captured, it will take decades to rebuild what's being destroyed in months. Unitary executive theory would give Trump and subsequent presidents unprecedented power to remove and replace any federal employee and impose their will on every decision in every agency, which means this isn't just about Trump, it's about every future president who will inherit this unchecked power, every authoritarian impulse that will no longer face institutional resistance, every illegal order that will be implemented without question because everyone who might have said no has been fired and replaced with a loyalist. Justice Kagan's warning echoes across the marble halls of the Supreme Court, like a prophecy we're watching come true in real time: massive, uncontrolled, unchecked power in the hands of the president. That's not hyperbole. That's not partisan rhetoric. That's a sitting Supreme Court justice describing with clinical precision the constitutional catastrophe her colleagues are engineering, and the fact that she's in the minority, that her dissents will be filed away as historical footnotes while the majority opinion becomes the law of the land, should tell you everything you need to know about where we are and where we're headed. The republic is being dismantled, piece by piece, precedent by precedent, firing by firing, and the only question that remains is whether we'll recognize what we've lost before it's too late to get it back.